we are talking today about something I think is really important when it comes to your health, your well-being, and overall your fitness journey, and that is emotions. As a fitness coach, I see a lot of emotionally charged decisions, and I think there are a lot of things that are impacting us when it comes to our emotions that honestly, most fitness programs, if you think about the things that you can buy or coaches that are going to help you, emotions is the big part of the iceberg that's under the surface that nobody wants to talk about or deal with. But yet I think it's one of the biggest, most impactful things. So to help us talk about that today, we have Ashleigh, and she is coming as a nutrition coach. And she had an incredible post the other day that I just really got a lot of value out of and thought was an important topic to discuss. And so I just want to read that real quick. She said, learning to manage, sit with, and overcome emotions is one of the most underrated things for weight loss, weight management, or general health goals. That really got me thinking about emotions and overcoming emotions, not just as something that should remain buried and under the surface, but actually something that we in the health community need to talk about more, need to address more, because I think ultimately that is the biggest predictor for success. So Ashleigh's here. She has the Wellness Diaries podcast. And so go check that out for sure. And check out her Instagram. We'll plug that in the show notes and at the end. But Ashleigh, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I love podcasting and having good conversations.
Absolutely. It gives a good format for it. So tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into nutrition coaching. I know we have a shared love of Lane Norton. We kind of connected over him and just the kind of no BS approach that he has to talking about the science of nutrition. And you seem to be really big into the nutritional sciences and understanding like the research and stuff. So how did you get into that? That's definitely a smaller niche.
Yeah, so I actually started really getting into fitness and nutrition when I was around 14, and I started in the bodybuilding community. I was very obsessed with all things bodybuilding. That's the style of training that I did. I was very intrigued. I loved learning about fitness and nutrition. If I had any downtime, I was looking things up on the internet, and that's how I came across Lane Norton. And I just fell in love with how he talked about, this is back when like reverse dieting was starting to come out, and he was talking about contest preps for bodybuilding shows and things. And it was just really interesting because that's what I was into at the
Mm,
time. Um, and so that's kind of how I got into fitness. But then as things progressed, like I started doing CrossFit. I started competing in CrossFit and in Olympic weightlifting nationally, as well as powerlifting. And so I was just I don't want to say all or nothing, but I can be very intense with anything that I do. And so when I was doing those things, I was like, I'm going to go all the way and like try to do it to my like the best ability that I can and do the most, and always, always working to be better. And nutrition coaching was something that I kind of fell into as a byproduct of competing in Olympic weightlifting. Actually, I had a coach at the time. I had to make weight for a competition, and I really, because I enjoyed learning about fitness and nutrition anyway, the process of my having to lose weight through tracking my food and all of this stuff, it made me really want to become a coach myself at some point, because I was getting people asking me how I did it, and how did you do this and you were allowed to eat this, because that was when paleo was really huge. People had good bad food mindset. I mean, they still do, but
sure.
they saw the things I was eating and they're like, "Oh, how did you lose all of this weight? Tell me how you did it." And I was like, I really like helping these people, but it's taking a lot of time. Maybe I should just become a coach myself. And so I did some basic certifications, and I knew a lot anyway, but I wanted to have something um, you know, next to my name that I could have to make me look a little bit qualified, I guess. So I did that, and then I just started coaching in 2015. But I've been in the community in CrossFit ever since then. I still do CrossFit, but it's crazy to see how far nutrition coaching has come. Like I remember when I first started it, there
Or how
was
far down it's come.
Well, yeah, fair point. Yeah, it's definitely it's a lot more saturated, which is like good for the good coaches, but not so good for the ones that have no idea what they're doing and inflicting harm on people.
Mm,
But it's crazy because I'm sure you're familiar with. Are you familiar with working against gravity?
hmm
It's a really yeah, so that's who my coach was through back then. And that was when they only had 3 coaches, like, it was such a small
hmm
community. And on the online space, and especially in the CrossFit space, there was just not that many coaches. So seeing it blossom as far as it's come now is kind of crazy, but yeah, I love what I do. I love seeing people change their lives and like feel in control and confident through the changes that they make.
Absolutely, that's amazing. So through your journey in fitness, CrossFit, bodybuilding, what are some things that you've seen in your own experience when we kind of transition over into talking about emotions, right? Um, how did emotional eating play a role in your journey? Obviously, you're at most of my audience is general population. You know, they're working moms, working dads, people staying really busy, looking for some ways to maybe as they're driving in the car, listen in, get some things that they can start to add into their life. So maybe at a different level than the competitive nature that you're coming at. But I think we're human, and those emotions play on all of us. I think sometimes people think that competitors or even elite athletes don't have to deal with the day-to-day stresses, or their stress responses are different, or emotions just don't play a role in their eating. And so what would you kind of say in terms of how emotions played a role through your journey, and what did that look like?
Yeah, so first I want to let the audience know that there's different types of emotional eating, and emotional eating in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but it can become a bad thing when it's your only way to manage your emotions and if it's the only coping strategy that you have. But for example, there's, emotional eating because of stress,
Mm,
or maybe it's boredom, or maybe you're trying to suppress something, or maybe it's through celebration, or like there's different types of emotion, like maybe a reward or something. Like there's different categories of it. But like I said, at a certain point, it can become not good for you depending on what your goals are if you're doing it too frequently. So for me personally, I've never dealt with it in the sense that it's harming me, but I've dealt with it in the sense where I'm aware of it, and sometimes it would like annoy me, and sometimes it would almost feel like it's controlling you versus me controlling it. And that's what a lot of people think when they deal with this. They're like, I just feel like I can't stop, or I feel like it's just, I'm not even hungry, but I'm still eating it. I don't know why I'm doing it.
mm,
And so for me, I did it way more often if I was dieting. And I would do it if I was alone.
mm,
So I think and the reason I say that is because a really big part of understanding it for yourself is knowing your triggers. So if you know that you tend to come home from work and go straight to the pantry and start eating on things without really even being super mindful, I would get curious about what happened that day, or if it's a consistent pattern. Like, what did your meals look like that day? Did you eat enough for breakfast and lunch? Did you get home and were you super, super hungry?
mm,
Or were you just overwhelmed from the day and you needed some like alone time for yourself? And for you, that's kind of just getting some enjoyment out of eating something tasty. So if you can understand why you're doing it and understand your triggers, it can help you backpedal and break that chain somewhere. So I had a client that, dealt with the coming home from work thing and eating a lot. And for her, it was multifaceted. For her, food is a big comfort. It was something that she really leaned on when she was a child. And that was just like her source of comfort. For some people, it's food. For some people, it could be alcohol. For some people, it could be, exercise is their comfort. Like we all have different comforts. And so for her, it was a mixture of it was a comfort. And also, she wasn't really eating to me a big enough breakfast and lunch. So by the time she would come home, she was just really hungry. And I think sometimes, side tangent, if you're tracking your macros, it can be very easy to unintentionally hoard your food for the later part of the day because you're afraid of running out. And a lot of times this ends up just backfiring because then
Mm-hmm.
you do at some point get extremely hungry. And so that can kind of go against you. So I'm always a big component of I'm a big advocate for having larger filling meals to reduce that sort of feeling at the end of the day. And most people find that when they do start eating bigger meals, they don't feel like they want a boredom snack as much. They're not thinking about food as much because they're actually full and satiated.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, yeah, find out what your triggers are, and don't be judgmental about it. Like we all do this at some point. We all struggle with this in some capacity. But if you can just be curious about why it's happening and then go backwards and see how you can break the chain, it makes it a lot easier to not do it. And that could involve creating barriers. It could be changing your environment. So for my client that would come home and go straight to her pantry, I'm like, okay, how can we break this pattern? Can you go home and immediately go on like a 5 to 10 minute walk instead and just break the mental monotony of what you normally do to create a little bit more mindfulness and intention? Because emotional eating, anything that's reactive and impulsive like that, you're not you're not being present and you're not being intentional. And so if we can pull you back in to being intentional, it can make you think about your choices a little bit more.
No, that's so valid, and I think you brought up a couple great points in terms of recognizing those patterns that we've built, and a lot of times those patterns are not even conscious. These are things that are just ingrained through, create these mental pathways, but we also create these action pathways outside our house. We've only lived here for a few months, and there's a certain path around the house from the front of the house to the back of the house that has already been worn. We have two dogs, and you can already see that the grass is not growing there along that path. And every time I go out back to call them in to eat, they come running around and they follow the exact same path, the same pattern over and over and over again. We tend to do those same things. We get into these ruts, whether that's in our exercise, like you were talking about, but particularly when it comes to our nutritional habits. And I think a lot of times when people are trying to lose weight, the rut often becomes restrict, 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 and then the response becomes, oh, I just have these cravings, or I have this emotional response, or I have this inability to curb this. But I think, and you can kind of speak to this, do you find that that's primarily because of their lack of nutritional intake? Do you think that's just a response to too few calories and their body is just responding and that's how it responds, and then we internalize that a little bit too much? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that go into cravings, whether they're emotional or physical. I think just knowing that you're in a deficit, I think it makes you mentally a little bit more food focused and a little bit more wanting food. Because if you're thinking about food, if you're thinking, oh, I'm eating less now because I'm trying to lose weight, you're going to be thinking about food more. And regardless of if you're hungry or not, thinking about food more makes you more food focused and could potentially lead to you eating something when you're not hungry. And that's actually a big thing right now with like Ozempic. Ozempic is a drug that we don't have to get into like too detailed with what that does, but um, it helps a lot of people reduce the food noise that they experience because that's something that really affects people. If they think about food all day, the chances of them overeating is going to be way higher because food is just always on their mind. And so that's one component, is just like our mindset in general. If we know that we're having less food, like if I tell you not to think about an elephant right now, you're going to immediately just start thinking about an elephant. When we have less of something, when there's scarcity, when we are restricting something, even if it's done in a sustainable way, we're going to be a little bit more food focused. So I think having good expectations with it is needed. So understanding, okay, I'm in a calorie deficit right now. If my goal is fat loss, hunger is normal, period, but also an elevated level of hunger is expected as well when you're dieting. And that doesn't mean that you need to act on it. You know, you can feel it and it's not an emergency. So just knowing that and being aware of that can help a little bit, because if you don't go
Mhm.
into it with that mindset, you might just get really hungry and be like, oh my goodness, I have to eat something right now. And it's like, no, you don't. You know, we're very reactive, and that's what causes a lot of this impulsive decision making. And so if we can just set our expectations up to expect to be a little bit more hungry, expect to want food and think about food a little bit more, then I think it kind of lessens some of that I have to act on this feeling, if you can expect it. And I don't think it has anything to do, or I don't think it has to do with restriction necessarily in terms of food all the time either. It could be you're like repressing something else. So like you could be not allowing yourself to like work through something emotionally, or you're trying to numb your emotions. So you're suppressing that but using food to numb that out. So it's not that you're restricting food, but maybe you're restricting yourself from actually being able to work through certain things. Like I said, it's a coping mechanism. So if
Mm.
you're restricting yourself emotionally, if you're restricting yourself socially, if you know, blah blah blah, if you're restricting anything, then having some sort of reaction to that is gonna happen. I was talking to someone else about this. I can't remember who gave me this analogy, but if you think about like a ball that you play with in the pool, you know, it floats on the water. But if you push it all the way down to the bottom and you know, suppress it underwater, but then you let go, it shoots way out. And the
Mm.
farther you push it down, the more force it's going to have going up. And that was kind of a great analogy to think about when it comes to suppressing anything, because it doesn't even have to be with just food. With people, we can have coping mechanisms that could be anything, like exercise. You can exercise too much,
Hmm.
and that can be your coping mechanism. it's
Yeah.
it's a more socially acceptable one, but it's still something that could be abused nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm working through this issue with one client right now, and the emotional response to the scale not changing the way that she's hoping, or family situation, or the weekends being harder, seems to be there's constantly something that's causing that emotional roller coaster. And I got a message from her just the other day, and we had a come to Jesus, opportunity on our last one-on-one call, and we were just talking through this, and and I said something about emotions not dictating actions, and she kind of internalized that and created a little bit of a mantra for herself. And she messaged me the other day and said I was really struggling emotionally on my way home from work, and she said, but I told myself my emotions do not change my body's needs. And I thought that was really powerful, because we have biological needs. And for me, my emotional response to stress, for example, is to not eat. When I get super stressed, right, your parasympathetic nervous system is really high, and it's really, digestion. If people are really nervous and anxious all the time, they'll tell you that they have a lot of digestive issues, right? Because if your sympathetic nervous system, excuse me, is really activated, then you're creating a lot of cortisol, your adrenaline is up, and all of that, and you're just not going to be able to digest food properly in the right way. Versus when your parasympathetic system is activated and you're rested, right? Rest and digest, right? Is what that is responding to. Then you're going to be able to actually. And so if I feel stressed, I just feel like I can't eat. I feel like I can't digest. I feel like I've got an upset stomach. And so for me, it's really important to not allow those emotions to impact um, the way I need to take care of my body. And so a lot of times there's that sort of decision tree that if I want to just create more stress and really play into stress in my life, then what are the eventualities? What are the outcomes of that? It's going to lead to some, to pretty severe degradation. It's going to lead to some pretty severe impacts on my nutritional intake. It's going to not allow me to get the muscle that I'm trying to build or hit that PR in the gym. And so the ripple effects of that have to be examined. And I loved how you talked about sitting with. So yes, we can think about overcoming emotions, but I think sometimes that makes people think that emotions are always bad. And you said it earlier, emotional eating isn't bad by default. Sometimes we do need to sit with that. Sometimes we need to learn to manage it, sometimes overcome it, sometimes just push through it. So, how would you kind of see the difference between sitting with and overcoming? How would you tease that out a little bit?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, myself included, sitting with emotions is very uncomfortable. And we would rather distract ourselves or avoid it rather than sitting with it. So for me, I like to listen to music or sometimes journal. I don't love journaling, but sometimes I will if I really need to do something where I can write things out. Um, but just like allowing yourself to feel them and like go through it versus trying to avoid or suppress. And actually, there is some neuroscience that supports like when we walk, it can really help you process and work through emotions. It has something to do with the way that our eyes look left and right as we're
Mm-hmm.
walking. And it really does help with emotional processing, which I thought was super cool. So that's why walking is such a great habit, regardless of what your fitness goals are. I think it's super important to move. But that's a
Absolutely. As
good.
opposed to as opposed to looking at a screen, right? You think about
Oh
the
yeah,
way, yeah, it's biological, and I think it's also, you think about the human experience for thousands of years as foragers, as hunters, as people. We were on the go. We were looking for our food on the go, and when we're sitting, we don't have that. I definitely think there's an impact in terms of our emotional response and to our impulses when it comes to food, for sure.
yeah, and I think part of it too is just we're very judgmental of ourselves. So if we feel something that's uncomfortable or that we would perceive as a negative feeling, it's easier to want to suppress those. But like think about all the happy feelings that we have. We
Hmm.
don't we don't suddenly get this huge burst of like happiness and joy and then go hide in our pantry and like snack on things. Like that's not our normal response usually to feeling an immense overwhelming positive feeling. It's usually the negative ones. So if we can just first understand that we don't have to like judge ourselves for feeling a certain way or feel like it's icky or bad to feel a certain way, we can just be curious about what we're feeling and be like, okay, why am I feeling this way? What's it from? Did I get enough sleep last night? Am I stressed out from work? Okay, what can I do to like actually resolve this or benefit it in a little bit of a way other than food? Because is food really going to fix this issue? Maybe momentarily, maybe eating an Oreo is going to momentarily feel really good, of course. But what about an hour from now? Are those feelings still going to be there? Are you still going to have those unmet um, needs or however you want to say it? So that's why sitting with them can be really important because you're practicing not being reactive. And that's something that, again, like I was talking about breaking the chain, that breaks the chain. When you don't react, when you just sit with, understand, be curious about it, it really can make a difference. And I actually posted something on Facebook a couple weeks ago and I asked a question and said, "What do you tell your kids when they don't want to do their homework?" Just curious. And it's funny because a lot of the responses I got were so applicable to health and fitness. They'd be like, "Oh, you need to do your homework because even though it's not fun, you have to practice something to get good at it and it's a skill and it's going to benefit you later on. It might not feel fun in the moment or you might not get instant gratification from it in the moment, but down the line it's going to help you get good grades, it's going to help you go to a good school, it's going to help you be smarter, like all this stuff that you can apply to health and fitness." And then I made a podcast about it and I thought it was super cool because think about how many things that we don't feel like doing that we need to do. If we all just didn't do the things that we didn't feel like doing, we would get nothing done. I don't feel like doing the dishes. I don't feel like doing laundry. I don't feel like going to bed on time. I don't feel like doing a lot of things. But we can't let that like actually dictate what we do, or else we would never do anything. So,
Absolutely. No, that's spot on. So we've kind of hit on a couple different things. One would be the impacts of our day to day and recognizing we've got to break down our triggers in terms of like patterns that we have or triggers about getting home, going to the pantry, those kinds of things. We've seen a little bit about stress and how high stress is going to impact nutritional choices. And we've seen some of the, more emotions in terms of, like you were talking about, some judgmental self, reflection and things like that, and trying to avoid that and using food to compensate. I think there are some deeper emotions as well that we need to think about. And obviously, you mentioned joy, and I think that's a beautiful one on the spectrum, because I think food is an incredible source of joy. I think food is it's been used. There's a great book called Near a Thousand Tables, and it's the history of food, and it goes into all the ways that food has been used as a key aspect of celebration. It's how we are as human beings. Every culture uses food, and we have certain foods for certain celebrations. We have certain foods for certain holidays, and these are intangible and integral parts of being human. And we don't want to cut that out. And I think a lot of times, as in the fitness world or nutritional world, we can kind of make it seem like there's no space for that, and there is. But on the flip side of joy, we also have issues of shame. We have issues of guilt. We have issues of self loathing. We also have issues of feeling like a failure. I think a lot of people that, and I had a conversation with someone just the other day, and they're like, yeah, I kind of already blew it this morning. So, what the heck. And I think a lot of times, and that's kind of a, silly way to think about it, but I think a lot of times we do have those responses, and we can get into a pattern of, well, I ruined my breakfast. So why does it even matter? I might as well just go full in and just, blow this out of the water. And I think the other thing that a lot of people experience is guilt over their food choices, or guilt over what they see in the mirror, or what the scale says, or maybe even some history of, of shame or bullying or whatever those triggers are. But let's talk about those deeper emotions for a little bit. And how do you think through um, helping a client who's dealing with the issues of guilt or shame?
so if I have a client that's dealing with shame or guilt, I want to first address like how they're viewing food. So if you're viewing food from a very fixed mindset, so thinking of food as good or bad, the black and white thinking, that's going to have a direct effect on your guilty feelings. And so we
Mm,
first have to, talk about the fact that food is neutral. It's not good or bad. There are more nutritious foods than others, but food is not, it's just, it's just food. It's not this good or bad thing. You're not going to lose weight from eating a carrot, and you're not going to gain weight from eating a donut. It's calorie balance, okay? And then so having to work through that, it's a lot easier said than done, because people have had this mental programming for a long, long time. And so I think a big part in overcoming that is just exposing yourself to it more often, to just to get someone to see like, oh, I can eat that and I didn't just gain 10 pounds overnight. Wow, cool. So doing some, exposure therapy, if you will, with
mm,
integrating some of those foods in your diet can be really helpful mentally. Um, but then also just like believing that you can change your mind about it, because that's the whole thing about growth versus fixed mindset. People with a fixed mindset have very black and white thinking. They're very all or nothing. If their breakfast wasn't perfect, the rest of their day is going to not be perfect either, rather than thinking, okay, my breakfast wasn't very nutritious this morning, but my next meal is a next opportunity to change something. So someone with a growth mindset would see that as a failure, or they would see it as an opportunity to grow and to evolve and adapt over the rest of the day. Someone with a fixed mindset would just see it as a failure and be like, why try? Because I wasn't perfect. And so I think just trying to have a more growth mindset will not only help with viewing food in a different way, but it will help in so many other ways too. Like you mentioned earlier before about the scale not changing for a client. Um, separating that from, okay, scale not moving doesn't mean good or bad. It's just a data point that we track. And yes, of course, if you're trying to lose weight, we want to see that go down at some point. But too many people get caught up in those daily fluctuations.
Hmm.
And that's where it can make or break someone with a fixed mindset because they see it go up and they're like, oh, I did something bad. Why am I even trying? I might as well give up. Like it just sends people down into a
Hmm.
spiral. And so if we can adopt more of a growth mindset, and know that one instance of doing something that's out of routine or off plan or whatever is not going to change the course of things really. And I love little analogies or metaphors. I honestly don't know the difference between the two. But there's a few out there that I'm sure you've heard of where like if someone pops a tire, you don't pop the other three just because you popped one of them, you know? And then another one that I've heard is like when you're on a trip and you're driving to a destination, what if you get caught in traffic, there's an accident, and there's like a line of cars and you have to sit and wait? You don't get to that and then say, ah, dang it, I hit traffic. Now I have to turn around and go back home. No, we still continue. It might take a little bit longer to get there,
Hmm.
but we're still going towards our destination. And another one is like a GPS. If you take a different route, if you miss a turn, it reroutes you. It doesn't say, oh, you didn't take the route that I gave you. Now go back home. No, it gives you another route to go on to get to your destination. So, for example, if someone has a breakfast that they weren't intending to, maybe someone brought donuts to work and you really just wanted one, you can eat that donut and then say, okay, I blew it. The rest of the day is garbage. I'm going to get takeout for every meal now. Or you can say, okay, how can I reroute my day and maybe have more protein and vegetables at my lunch and make sure I get a lot of protein at dinner? Like it doesn't have to be this all or nothing way. That's not ever going to help someone get to where they want to be.
No, that's spot on. I have a framework that I like to use. I don't remember where I got it from, but it's is it true? Three questions to ask yourself, right? About the thoughts that you're thinking when it comes to guilt and shame. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? Could very much be true, um, but is it helpful? The way that you're saying it and how you're speaking to yourself. And then the last one, is it kind? So you could say, I suck at eating a good breakfast. Is it true? It very well might be true, right? Is it helpful? It's really not that helpful because it's just kind of breaking me down. Is it kind? Not at all, right? So another way of framing it is I'm struggling to make a good breakfast. Is it true? Yeah. Is it helpful? Not as much. Is it kind? It's much kinder. So how can we make that statement even more helpful? I'm struggling to make a good breakfast, so I will add a protein source. Is that true? Yes. Is it helpful? Is it kind? Yes. So the more you can get aligned with those three questions in your decision tree, the more likely that you're going to revert away from guilt and shame and sort of this self condemnation. And the more you're going to shift things over into like you're talking about a growth mindset, into a how do I learn from this and how do I actually improve this situation and not just let this spiral. And I think a lot of times we allow one negative action to spiral us into a whole cascade of negative decisions because, well, I've already done X, so I might as well as. And the tire analogy is just a great one. If one of my kids, trips and falls and skins their knee, I don't just go out and make the other three go skin their knee. You know, that's very similar. That doesn't solve anything, right? By harming yourself in some other way, it doesn't fix what was originally the problem. And I like to think of it as, is my emotional response aligned with my overall goals, right? Is my emotional response aligned with my overall goals? And what I mean by that is your emotional response in terms of nutrition and what you eat could very much be in alignment. You could be feeling bad, but the food that you're eating is still in alignment. You could be feeling great, and the food that you're eating is still in alignment. And the inverse is also true. You could be feeling terrible, and the food you're eating is not in alignment with where you're trying to go and your overall objectives. So when we kind of think of it and we shift it away from um, I'm at fault kind of scenario to a is this helping me or is this hurting me? And all of a sudden, instead of seeing our food choices as who we are, we start to see our food choices as a reflection of where we're going.
Yeah, and you mentioned shame and guilt, and that's a big reason why I think it's important to be observant and curious about our feelings and emotions and thoughts, because if we judge them and we're shameful and we're guilting ourselves, that, shame and guilt come from when you think that you did something wrong, or when
Mm,
you think that you are wrong, or, not doing something well. And it's very hard to act in alignment with, like what you said, with your goals when you're just shaming yourself all the time. And so, a great way to give yourself a little bit more self compassion, I always tell clients that, first of all, it's always harder for yourself to give yourself self compassion. We're very hard on ourselves naturally. So what I do is I just tell them, think about if you had a really close friend of yours come to you with the same exact problem, and what would you say to them? And it would be something, I'm sure, that's so helpful and so understanding and so empathetic, but they can't do that to themselves. But if we can shift that perspective, it can be a lot more helpful. And then you're acting in a different way. You're not being reactive out of that negative shame and guilt, but you're going to be doing something a lot more productive and like you said, helpful, like in your framework. And so I think that is a huge shift, is just being compassionate with yourself, and it allows you to actually make helpful changes versus just reacting off of emotion. And then also, um, when we think about emotional eating or overeating or binge eating, it typically, I don't know if you've seen like little graphics of a cycle where it's like restrict, binge, guilt and shame. So then you restrict again, and then it's like this cycle that
hmm
continues.
Yeah.
And so, like I was talking about breaking the chain somewhere, if we can break the part where it's the guilt and shame, then we're breaking that cycle. So maybe if you reduce or remove the guilt and shame, maybe then you won't want to restrict again, because the restriction comes from, I did something bad. I'm a bad person. I
Mm,
failed. So I'm going to restrict again. But then you're just reinforcing the pattern over and over and over again.
right.
And and so breaking it up somewhere is helpful, but also knowing that guilting yourself or shaming yourself, that's not really ever going to produce something positive. It's just going to make you feel worse, which is going to make you want to do something that either keeps you from feeling those feelings of shame, or you're just going to have that, I did this, so I might as well do this, and then go down that whole spiral. So
Yeah. Very well said. I thought we could end on some of our favorite practices that you might recommend for people to try out. And you'd mentioned journaling. I'm not a journaler either, but one of the strategies that I've used with a lot of clients and for myself is when you are feeling those negative emotions to do like a gratitude list, right? Gratitude journaling. So that's one that I would throw out there is like just write down some things that you're grateful for, because it's really hard to be at the one hand grateful and on the other hand really self-deprecating or really filled with shame or really filled with stress. So that's one. What's something you got?
I love that. I don't know. So like I said, I don't love journaling. I would say figure out what that emotion is that you're feeling, and think of other ways that you've either in the past or currently can feel that same feeling.
Mm,
So if let's say you're trying to eat because it brings you joy. A lot of people unfortunately, food is like the only joy they feel in their day because everything is so hectic. They're busy, they're stressed out. Food is like that joy. They're like, finally, something enjoyable today. So, like, what are some other ways that you can feel joy?
Mm,
Is that maybe having a hobby? Is that maybe talking to a friend? Is that going for a walk with a friend? What are some other ways that are more conducive to your overall health that can bring you joy? Maybe it's watching a funny video. I don't know.
mm,
Laughing is super helpful, honestly. Like, laughing is such a good antidote to feeling sadness or any sort of negative emotion like that. But again, a lot of those things are so much easier said than done, but it requires some pausing and being intentional about that next decision rather than being reactive. So it will feel like some work, to change that, but it's worth it.
yeah, I would call that, if I had to give it a name, like outlet swapping, right?
Hmm.
Um, Swap that thing that makes you feel that way for something else that also allows you to feel that way,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Cool. Another one for me, I think, would be to just write out a daily win, because I think a lot of times we fail to celebrate the things that we are doing well, and we hyper fixate on the areas that we're not doing great. So if you're a person who's tracking your macros, maybe you blew your calorie target, but your protein was on point. Hey, I instead of focusing on I messed up my calories, like I hit my protein, right? And we recognize that as like this is something that I can actually put a win in my belt, because even though I struggled in one area, I still achieved something in another area. So finding something within the spectrum of your struggle that you can find and celebrate as a win.
Yeah.
You got
Yeah. And
anything else?
so it's not, I don't know if this is one of the things you can do to cope with emotions necessarily, but it's kind of piggybacking off of what you just said. A lot of times we will say things in a sentence structure like, I hit my macros, but
Mm-hmm.
I maybe didn't do this and this, and maybe like you're framing it in a negative perspective. If we can change the but to and, it makes it sound a lot better. So like, I hit my macros today and I probably could have done a little bit better with my food quality.
Mm.
That sounds so much better than the but statement. So just reframing how
Or
you
put
say
the
it.
negative one first, right? Like you
Yeah.
can swap them,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden now it's like I didn't hit my overall target, but I did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love
that's
that.
great. Yeah, those little frames I think can be really helpful in terms of, and I think a lot of times working with somebody, working with a coach like yourself can be really helpful, because the coach will spot those little ways that you tend to frame things, and we pick up on our clients' emotional states pretty quickly, and recognizing like sort of this self-defeating attitude, or we recognize a really positive like growth mindset, and we can kind of call those things out in a sense, and highlight. So I think those are great, just giving our listeners a few different things to take away and some things that they can start to implement as they find those small wins, as they start to do the things that you can do tomorrow. Just start with something. Start with a little bit of journaling. Start with a little bit of um, thoughtful reflection on why do you feel that way. What are your triggers? Analyzing, breaking those things down, talking it out with somebody, swapping out your outlet for something else. Any of those would be something great to start with, and then just keep rolling with those things to build that momentum. And you'll definitely see a lot of improvement in terms of the way that you deal with emotion, in particular the way that emotional eating might be impacting your weight loss or your general health. So, Ashleigh, thank you so much for making time for this today. I want everybody to go follow her on Instagram, and also the Wellness Diaries podcast. Definitely check that out. If you don't mind, tell us your Instagram handle.
So my Instagram handle is at Ashleigh Marie Hubbard, and I spell my name Ashleigh. So to keep that in mind. But then
Yeah.
then you can find me on the Wellness Diaries podcast as well. And yeah.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, hey, thanks again for making time to talk to my audience. And this was really valuable, and I appreciate your expertise in this area. And we'll see you around. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.